Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Dave Rosen, faculty member here at the IOF. Today's speaker is Dr. Pavan Sukhdev. And I'd like to start, though, by acknowledging that the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries is based on the UBC Point Grey campus, which is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This seminar is online, and so if you have a question for our speaker, please pose your question in the chat box or raise your hand by using the reactions box, and I'll get to your question. Finally, we wish to remind everyone that it's their responsibility to help create a positive speaking and knowledge exchange experience, especially for graduate students and early career scholars. We ask that we work together to make this a good experience for all and raise only mindful and respectful questions or comments in this forum. To introduce our speaker today will be our own Dr. Rashid Samaila. Rashid.
Yeah, so thank you very much, David. And I'm really very happy to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Pavan Sukhdev. And he is an environmental economist, and his focus has been and continues to be on the green economy and on international finance, actually. And he was a special advisor and head of UNEP's Green Economy Initiative. And this was really where Pavan and I got to work. He invited me to lead the fisheries chapter, and we did amazing stuff and published reports and papers. Then Pavan was also the study lead for the groundbreaking TEEB, which you are going to hear about now, the latest about it, a very important effort to try to bring biodiversity and ecosystems into economics, which has been a huge success actually. Now he's a founder and CEO of GIST Advisory. Maybe during Q&A we'll get to learn more about that, and I think it's great. We're trying to train people who can enter into all sorts of places, create your own companies and so on. So it was nice to see your own NGOs to see this. Yeah. So Pavan has done a lot. I mean, I have pages to read, but I wouldn't. He has earned several recognitions, obviously, for all the good work. He was appointed UNEP Goodwill Ambassador in 2012. He serves on several boards. He's won the Tyler Prize, which people here know about because Daniel and myself had the privilege of winning that recently. Pavan won it before us. He also won the Blue Planet Prize, which is huge, right? So you are getting a top international economist, financial expert to tell you something, share his knowledge. So thank you, Pavan, for doing this. I and the group here appreciate you a lot. One more thing, actually, Pavan served as the president of the WWF for Nature, which is huge, right? From 2017 to 2021. So yeah, let's hear from you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rashid, and for your very kind words and great introduction to me. I've definitely had quite a mixed life coming from the worlds of science. My first degree was with physics at Oxford, and then going from there, if you like, according to some people, digressing away from science into economics, and then from there into banking and finance, and then finally finding my heart in the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, which was the name of the project. Now I'm going to share screen so that we can launch straight away into the presentation that I've prepared for you guys. Actually, it's quite. I gave Rashid four topics to choose from, and this was the last one. I thought, well, I mean, in case he's interested in TEEB, and I had prepared pitches for all of the others, Rashid, but not for this one. So I had to do this specially for you, actually. So it's like, thank you for making life complicated for me. But anyway, it's a topic which is close to my heart. So I hope that I'll be able in the next 40 minutes to be able to convey some essence of what was achieved, which was significant, but possibly equally and perhaps more interestingly for people like yourselves, some of you are research scholars, some of you are teachers at the university, but especially for the research scholars and the students. Guys, this is what can still be done. So I'm talking to you about not just what has been achieved, but mainly about what's the unfinished agenda of TEEB. So what is TEEB? Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. let me share these slides with you and what's next with it. If we were to say in a simple way, what is TEEB? It's about ensuring that there's enough research available and enough analysis that the value that nature delivers to our economies and therefore to our societies and communities is recognized in the world of policy, in the world of administration, and in the world of business. And that means recognizing and measuring and valuing externalities. So in a fundamental kind of way, TEEB is about fixing the inadequate economic lens that we are using today, where we measure private profits. We measure, in fact, at an aggregate level, GDP. But we don't necessarily measure the losses in public services or indeed the value of public services that are delivered by what is economically invisible, and that is nature. I was thinking, how do I launch with an example? Because that explains what things are about. And I could still not think of a better example than the study done by Professor Ed Barbier, one of my gurus, way back in 2007. And this was about studying the example of shrimp farms in South Thailand across an area in the southeast of Thailand. And this study focused on looking at the benefits that they provide and how what was driving the transition from mangrove forests into shrimp farms was an apparent sense that this was good for development. It was good for the community, good for the GDP of Thailand. And here are the numbers. So Barbier's study showed that if we measured just the private profits, as you know, profits plus salaries plus net rents plus depreciation added back plus a few other things, basically is GDP, right? So profits are a big part of the GDP. If you measure the profits of shrimp farms versus as in like the value addition from mangroves. Mangroves, yes, people collect firewood, so that saves them money. There's value addition there. Value, $584 per hectare per year. And on the flip side, the value of the shrimp farm is a stunning $9,600 per hectare per year. So obviously, case closed, right? Let's chop as many mangrove forests as we can, flatten out the areas, put up the bunds, and create shrimp farms. Not so easy. Because if you recognize that there's other dimensions to this, to begin with, what about the subsidies that are provided by the government to the shrimp farmers? When we take out the subsidies from the sort of the private profits column, then suddenly it shrinks from $9,600 per hectare to just mere $1,200 per hectare. So the comparison isn't that hot anymore. But when you complete that logic, saying, hang on, what about the benefits, the non-private benefits of mangroves, storm protection as a result of the mangroves becoming a bracket or a wall against the storms and cyclones that hit the coastline of Thailand, protect inland territory and inland construction and inland property? What about the storm protection value of the forest? And what about the fisheries nursery value of the forest? What if we add that on to the value, change the lens a bit from being a lens of private profits to the lens of public benefits? And once you've done 6-7 years of prawn farming, the reality is that you can't do that anymore because salt deposition and chemical deposition has been so intense that it's basically made it impossible to use the land for anything. And what if we account for that as a cost of shrimp farming? In other words, the restoration cost of the land that you've used. Well, when you do that, the answer is somewhat different. Then the value of the mangroves per hectare shoots up to $12,000 per hectare. And once you account for the losses, if you like, the public costs of restoring the land that is no longer usable after 6-7 years on prawn farming, it's not a positive $1,200. It's actually a negative $11,000. So you see, my friends, just changing the lens from the lens of private profits to the lens of public value completely changes what is the correct, appropriate action to take, which is, should you continue to convert mangrove forests along Southeast Thailand into more prawn farms? The answer changes. And this is iconic, and this is apocryphal, if you like, but let me just tell you a bit more about the framework of TEEB, which was about looking at valuation as a way of informing decision-making. So it has different operating spaces, and in each operating space, there's a whole tier of different responses, and here's what they are in a summarized fashion. And by the way, all of this is from the original TEEB report. Thank you, Rashid, for being a participant and a reviewer as well of that, amongst many others. The idea is that, look, value has been recognized way before economics was applied to recognize value. And for instance, when the Yosemite National Park was declared a national park, or even earlier, the North Downs in Yorkshire, in England. It was with the idea that these are valuable for posterity, and you should be not destroying them. And that's about recognizing value. But then you can also demonstrate the value, as I've just done in the case of the mangroves. They had significant value and economic demonstration. And the next stage, if it happens, when it happens, is capturing value is in, well, who's going to pay the purveyors or the custodians of the natural area, which is a public area and not a private area? Who's going to pay them or reward them to maintain it the way it is? I'm calling you right now from New York, where the water supply still comes from the Catskills Mountains, based on a 30-year contract with landowners, which reduces the level of pollution that they can inflict in that area, so that the supply still meets the standards of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So those landholders are paid by an old contract for changing their practices. That's capturing value. Now, that's a payment for ecosystem service, PES. Can everyone see on the screen 5 rows of red titles? These are basically the responses. Regional plans can be made, legislations can be introduced, certification can be done to demonstrate economic value, protected area evaluation can be done, and finally, I gave an example of the Catskills Mountain, payments for ecosystem services. Can people see my slides? I'm just asking for anyone to confirm that they can.
Yep.
Okay, cool. And now, but as you can see, this is quite a wide range of responses. And you're wondering, hang on, who's going to make these regional plans and who's going to do the certification and who's actually setting up payments for ecosystem services? And these are actually different areas, different, if you like, institutions in society, because regional plans and legislations are in the realm of regulations and policy. And certification and protected area evaluation are economic mechanisms which involve project people and governments and private sector participants and research agencies like yourselves as a research institution. And finally, there's also some markets. I've not actually put in much in there, but when we did the TEEB studies and consolidated all our numerous examples, we had about 119, well, exactly 119 examples, actually. And most of them were in the area of protected area evaluation and certification and payments for ecosystem services, legislations, and there were a few planning examples as well. And there were only about 6 or 7 that were actually pure markets example, biodiversity markets, largely in Australia and the US. So when TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity project, is thought of as, oh, you're monetizing nature, well, we are not actually. We are looking at valuation as a way of informing decision-making in many different societal operating spaces and with many different kinds of responses. And yes, some of those responses, the 6 or 7 that I mentioned, are indeed markets responses, but it's a tiny minority thereof. So TEEB is not just about markets. It's about economic mechanisms, it's about regulations and policies, and even societal norms, as we've also evaluated situations at the community level. So this is, my friends, the difference in TEEB, that whilst it was a research project that in the simplistic sense, it had some pretty unusual things. It's very clear purpose. Those of the 500 different researchers and peer reviewers who were involved would have heard me say, TEEB is about ending the economic invisibility of nature. And this, by the way, was the line that ensured that I was able to keep the peace between ecological economists and environmental economists, because they have different lenses, different perspectives with which to view things. But the both groups would agree that, yes, honestly, the economic invisibility of nature is a problem, and we should help you to remove it. And we instituted values. Now, this is a project with values. Quality, which means everything that we publish has to be peer reviewed by the best peer reviewers. Transparency. When we are selecting people to write, we actually announced the call and looked around and actually got the advisory board of TEEB to select the lead, what we call the lead authors of each of the reports that you see on the right-hand side. And inclusion was such an extent that for the chapter for the foundational report for academicians, which is the theory report, the dark blue one at the back, the chapter on valuation was reviewed, amongst others, by someone who had publicly gone on record saying that he disbelieved in the idea of valuing ecosystem services. So he was one of the peer reviewers of the chapter on valuing ecosystem services. So this is how inclusive we were. We had once, I remember, some random person called Charles, and we don't know if it's his real name or not, sent us in our interim report a list of mistakes that he said he had found. He gave us 10, 11 examples. I think 3 of them were correct. We actually evaluated. That was my friend at UF in Leipzig who did that. We checked each and every one of what he had said were mistakes, citation mistakes. And we found that actually he was correct on 3. So out of the 1,100 citations, 3 were wrong, and answer should be 0, but it was not a bad record. We wrote back to Charles, because it was an email, saying that, thank you very much for pointing this out, and you were right about 3 of these, but we don't agree with the others for the following reasons. And would you believe Charles writes back to us, thank you for being inclusive and transparent. You are much better than the IPCC. Now, I don't know what he had done with the IPCC. I have no idea, but clearly it had some interaction with them. And he felt, a random researcher felt that we were being inclusive and responsive. So that's good. And finally, the reports themselves were not called reports, they were called deliverables. And this was my sense of, I come from the world of finance. I've managed many departments, including research departments. And with researchers, I've always had to remind them, guys, this needs to be ready in the next 3 weeks, otherwise it's no use. So please, don't try and give me the perfect answer. Give me a good enough answer, which is logical and clear, and state your assumptions and make it transparent. So the idea of research being a deliverable, to a timeline was something that took a bit of communication. So, yes, we all have to deliver these reports, my friends, by the 28th of October, 2010 in Nagoya, in Japan. I will be standing in front of 100+ environment ministers, and I don't want to be shot for not having finished on time. So you will have to make sure that you deliver. So these are all deliverables. And there were 4 deliverables. One was the theory report, basically for academicians to consensus present what is the right way forward, framework, methodology, etc. Another one was for national and international policymakers. That's the blue report. Then there was one for, I would say, local and regional policymakers, but they're also administrators in a broad sense. And then that's the red report, red-colored cover. And then the yellow report, the gold-colored report, as we call it, is business, because business always has a great view of itself. So why not make it a gold report, make them read it? And then finally, the summary, executive summary, which was the green report. So this was, in a sense, the story of TEEB, guided by the advisory board. I still remember, so the cast of senior people you see here is quite well known. There are academicians like Ed Barbier and Juan Martinez Alier. There were Giles Atkinson, Achim Steiner, then the head of UNEP, Lord Stern, everyone's heard of him. I still remember when I went to Lord Stern and asked him for advice, saying that, the commission has asked me to do this project on the valuation of ecosystems and biodiversity, and they still haven't defined biodiversity. He just smiled and he said, well, isn't that your opportunity then, Pavan? So we did what we could. I couldn't do any unilateral things. It was working as a community. So yeah, we did try to present through TEEB our interpretation, our definition of ecosystems and biodiversity as well. The original TEEB partnership was basically around the 4 research institutions, IUCN, Helmholtz Institute, the UF in Germany, Liverpool University, and the IEEP in Brussels, funded by the German government and the European Commission, and hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme. But this original partnership was inclusive because our values said so: quality, transparency, inclusion, and change. And I forgot to mention that. We infuse the idea in people that the value of our reports is the change that it can make. So if your report is only of academic interest, it's not very useful. You need to be able to influence and enable policymakers to make better informed decisions. And you need to be able to enable researchers to inform these policymakers and businesses to make better decisions. So the purpose of this is ending the economic invisibility of nature. But if you like, the underlying reason for that purpose is that we want change. We want to deliver change. And this was very much the messaging that the board endorsed and encouraged me to take forward. Is that, yeah, our purpose is changed. So the partnership grew very rapidly, as you can see, expanded from those initial universities to include the UN CBD itself, who hosted us and did a lot of communications out from there, included private sector agencies like Price Waterhouse, taking care of the business TEEB for Business report, communicators like Spatial Access and Havas, a massive European agency, helping us with the communication. Other donors like UK and Sweden and Japan and Switzerland joining us in the fray to help support the conclusion of the project and so on. And finally, various different groups, including what was then called the TEEB for Business Coalition. On the top side, you see it's called the Natural Capital Coalition now. A separate group that spun off and included many people, which launched the TEEB for Brazil report, which was a kind of standard bearer for country-level studies of TEEB and so on. And it's just continuing to expand. And if I were to say that our goal is to, of course, make change, but what is the key underlying change that we wish to deliver? Yeah, ending the economic invisibility of nature. Why is it economic? Why economic invisibility? Because our economic compass is not fit for purpose. We are navigating our way through a complex and increasingly complex space of declining natural capital, of stressed out social capital, of increasing human capital, knowledge, skills, and health in some ways, but not in others. And we are not reflecting any of those changes in any of those capitals. And we are still focusing on the change in produced capital primarily to inform decisions. And that can't be right. And that itself needs to change. So in a fundamental kind of way, the key change that we wanted to inspire and drive was a change in the economic framework. In other words, the lens that we use to evaluate and to determine value should change. And we are still, some of us are still trying to do that. In fact, my company's role is to encourage investors to look at value delivered by companies beyond shareholder value, but actually stakeholder value, and to look, to begin with, at natural and human capital impacts of the company and not just its financial impacts on shareholders. So replacement required for this battered old compass that we are navigating a four-dimensional space of four capitals. We need a spaceship. And what do we have is a mariner's compass, which is useful on the seas to a limited extent, but not anymore. So I'll pause here and say, okay, think back, what insights, where next? Where does TEEB go next? Well, the key thing is, when we do all this, when we put in the effort and prepare the research and engage the decision makers and so on, what insights can we get by making the invisible visible? And what actions come out as the obvious ones? I just shared that with you, the payments for ecosystem services, the protected area valuations, and all of the other sort of categories of actions that can spin out of this thinking. And by whom, which is who is to make those decisions. And some of those decisions are made at the community level, some are made at the local government level, some are made at the national government level, some others yet have to be negotiated, as is going on with the Convention on Biological Diversity. The 30 by 30 is a classic example of that, negotiating country by country, what is their contribution to the overall 30 by 30 target, the so-called Target 3 of the UNCBD from Kunming, Montreal. And that brings me back to the key focus area of this lecture, which is what's left. So what is the unfinished agenda? And let me now come on to that unfinished agenda. So here are some of the things that there were 11 overall recommendations, and movement has happened, as Rashid pointed out, on many of them. But regrettably, Rashid, I would be the first person to admit that not all of what I consider really important recommendations of TEEB have seen the movement. So therefore, it is an unfinished project in my own thinking. Where are the key areas? So we talked about the unrecognized income contribution that nature makes to rural households. There's a constant apparent trade-off between poverty elimination and environmental stewardship. And what we have pointed out and demonstrated is that these are two sides of the same coin. But that messaging and that action agenda hasn't gone forward. Second, food systems are broken. I'll explain why. Wrong discourse, wrong lens, and these wrong discourses and wrong lens to measure the performance of food systems keeps them broken. Well, some progress on that, but not yet enough. More to do. An area close to your hearts, my friends, marine protected areas, were specifically pointed out by TEEB as an area where there is a benefit to communities and obviously to fisheries productivity and to biodiversity. And therefore, there should be more effort to create marine protected areas. And I'm pleased that since that time, clearly positive progress has been made. And thank you, Rashid, and all your colleagues working with you on fisheries subsidies for illuminating that space and making the truth come out better. But again, more work to be done. And then, to me, perhaps the biggest unfinished agenda, which I will talk about more, is the footprints of corporations. The private sector is 2/3 of the economy and jobs measured by whatever yardstick. In the US, it's 74% of GVA, 75% of jobs. It's huge. Its footprints on nature are the biggest footprints that are around. In other words, it is the private sector's operations and value chains that are causing most of the losses of biodiversity that we see. Why are we not doing something about it? Why are we not even measuring what these losses are in order to be able to engage those companies to cause less loss to begin with, or maybe to try and compensate for those losses? And lastly, knowledge itself is not 100%. I mean, we know a lot, but we don't know enough. We don't know enough about ecosystem functions. The sheer diversity of biomes and ecosystems on this planet is too much for us to know enough about it. The dynamics of ecosystems, how they will react to climate change and other effects that are happening at the same time. And when we engage interventions, how do we factor in our understanding, rudimentary understanding of ecosystem dynamics? Can we improve that? Can we integrate this better into how does it affect the social sphere? The ecological sphere on the planet affects the social sphere on the planet. How and to what extent? Can we get some more knowledge on that space? So there's quite a few important, in my opinion, unfinished agendas. And here's, I actually checked, and thank God I haven't lost my laptop since, I did actually lose my laptop in 2010, just before TEEB, and you won't believe the chaos that I'd caused as a result of that. I actually had to write emails to everyone. I'd send PowerPoints and notes to saying, can you please send them back to me so that I can basically recreate what I know about TEEB? Can you imagine? This was like 2 months before the Nagoya COP. Thankfully, I've learned my lesson. I keep my laptop with me and I haven't lost it since then. So I still have the slides, the original slides of TEEB from 2010. 20th October 2010 is actually the date on these slides. 28th is when we formally presented a much summarized version to the environment ministers. So these are the 3 areas which I want to focus on. Reducing natural capital losses in order to help the reduction, getting corporations to disclose, and getting to better recognition of the fact that conservation is actually good investment. We need to fully integrate into policy our dependence on ecosystem services, especially their role as a lifeline for poor households. We were talking about nature's flows, ecosystem services, into poor households as a form of resilience of the household, effectively providing them the bare modicum of subsistence at a time of stress, which is important to not take away because it's part of their incomes, it's a part of their resilience. And then to target development interventions, especially where most poor households reside, which is in smallholder farming, in stressed lands and poor conditions, and ensure that the social impacts of policies are not negative to those poor households. What does this mean? So here's what TEEB's results indicated. We looked at the contribution of agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, which are, if you like, the natural capital side of the contribution of GDP. If you look at that as a percentage of GDP, you're not impressed because the answers are 21%, 16%, and 10% in the case of Indonesia, India, and Brazil. But if you look at who are the affected populations, if, for instance, a forest is lost and village housewives have to travel another 5 kilometers every day to collect fuel wood to be able to cook food for their families, who is affected? It's the poor farmer. If the nutrients and fresh water that's coming from forests into the fields are no longer coming there and have to be replaced by purchases of fertilizers, who's affected? The poor farmer. When we started looking at the ecosystem services dependencies, then there were, well, these are estimated figures, but let's say 100 million people in Indonesia, 350 million in India, and 20 million mainly in the Amazon edges area of Brazil, who were depending primarily on ecosystem services for their core household income. And how much? Respectively, 75%, 47%, and 89%. So as against being relatively small and therefore probably ignored components of that, it was clear that nature's services, ecosystem services, are the GDP of the poor. So how can you engage development policy, which is willy-nilly destroying forests and damming wetlands and getting rid of natural capital, getting rid of ecosystem services, whilst at the same time stating your intention to be a development policymaker focused on alleviating and improving the lives of the poor? You can't. So you need to recognize that and build that into your policy solutions. This is huge. And Cheryl, just a quick snapshot. This is from our Green Economy report. but the same statistics apply. There's 2.6 billion people who rely on agriculture. That's about 400 million farms out of the 525 million farms are small farms, less than 2 hectares. And they cultivate about 60% of the arable land that exists. And it's research that found that a 10% or a 5%, a 10% increase in farm yields would give a 7% reduction in poverty in African countries and a 5% reduction in poverty in Asia. And therefore, green farming practices should be looked at as a potential solution. And this was encouraging for us that there was research done by Jules Pretty and others in 2006, as early as that, and published, which indicated that this was true, that sustainable farming methods were increasing yields. So we commissioned, after a couple of years of figuring out how to and funding it, we commissioned in 2016 a study led by Alexander Müller, my friend from Germany. He's the ex-agriculture secretary. Brilliant study and a great thinker and excellent manager of projects. He produced a study which basically delivered this report, measuring what matters in agriculture and food systems, recognizing the following 2 truths, which is that today the discourse in agriculture is all about, oh, how can we parachute help into poor areas to sort out food security? And the answer is, well, you don't actually. The world doesn't run anymore on or not that it ever did, on what is it, USPL 40 or whatever it's called, programs. It's not about parachuting food into distressed land, but it's about enabling farmers to grow better and earn more. And ironically, at this time, I'm talking about 2015, 16, an estimate came to us that 75% of the food that is consumed in these so-called poor lands and distressed lands and stressed lands is actually grown there. So the solution is not to try and transport food in or parachute food in. The solution is to help them to grow food better and increase yields, and in the process, increase incomes as well. And this is what the project did. And it did that by getting away from the mistaken single-dimensional lens of per hectare productivity. This has been the biggest mistake in economic analysis of our times, ever since human civilization, which is to look at per hectare productivity of crops on a 1 crop at a time basis. How much maize does this 1 hectare produce? Well, that's not the answer. The question is, what else is being grown there? And what else can you grow there? And what else can you do with that land? And then look at how many jobs can you create? And what is the health of people with and without pesticides and fertilizers, people on farm health as well as off farm health? When you start evaluating that with a comprehensive framework, which is what Alexander's team organized, and by the way, just like the original TEEB reports for 500 people, this was another massive task. It was 150 people put together. I was privileged to be the sort of project manager for Alexander at that time. And we completed the report on time, and its results were published by UNEP and by Nature as in the magazine Nature, in 2018. And it's been applied, it's been used. And here's my favorite example, which is actually from my country, India, but it's not only because it's from India. It's because the size of this program. So this is a natural farming program called the Andhra Pradesh Community Natural Farming Program. It has been driven by an ex-bureaucrat who was the chief secretary of that state, who couldn't convince his own agriculture department to test out natural farming, who after retirement got his previous boss, the chief minister, to fund him, and then got India's top technology firm, Wipro, to match that funding 20%, and then started a program based on the self-help groups that he had earlier created for microfinance in villages. And that microfinance self-help group essentially led him to, missed that. The microfinance group led him to build and build and build to a point when it went up from a couple of dozen people to 9,000 people, who are essentially mainly women. And once they've learned how to use natural farming techniques, his vision was very simple, which is that agriculture, my friends, is about biology, not chemistry. So let's try and find the solutions. And it's about using natural additives to soil from the location. We tested this out. We did a study. The TEEB for Agriculture and Food study was done using the TEEB Agri-Food framework and applying exactly the same principles that were enunciated by the TEEB Agri-Food, and found that when we looked, and by the way, we had to do 3 studies because there are 3 kinds of geological, geoclimatic areas out here. In the in the central area, which is the common river delta of the Krishna and the Godavari. I'm sort of outlining where that is here. It's basically lowland and irrigated farming. In the northeast, it is tribal low input farming because they can't actually afford much pesticides and fertilizers, but they don't know how to grow crops particularly well either. And in the southwest, it is dryland, rain-fed farming mainly, and that makes a huge difference what kind of farming techniques you use. So we tested this out using 550 households across 3 pairs, effectively, because there are 3 different projects rolled into one, 3 pairs of 4 villages each, 2 which were mainly natural farming and 2 which were similar to them, grew similar crops, but were using chemical farming. And we found that the yields were higher by, on average, 11%, the profits of the small farms higher by, on average, 49%, and that the health costs in the farmers, to the farmers, just the farmers' health costs, were 1/3 lower in the natural farming areas on average. And we also looked at the social structure in those communities, and through various yardsticks, we measured that the social structure was actually improving and had improved as a result of using this community-managed natural farming, where you share techniques and solutions and ideas and so on, and basically work together. They have common areas. For instance, they would collect cow urine together because nobody could afford a cow shed on their own. So there would be community cow sheds to collect the urine to use for inputs into this. So it creates more bonding, to have more to share, more to work together with. So all these factors that we measured using the TEEB agriculture approach, we found this worked. And what left me at the end of this project was that, look how young, poor, and in many cases scheduled caste, which means the poorest of the poor, women have just developed confidence and transformed themselves. The lady on the left-hand side was a single scheduled caste woman with no money. She borrowed 100,000 rupees. That's about $1,200. Borrowed 100,000 rupees from her self-help group and gradually did so well on her natural farming that she was nominated gradually to be a master farmer. Now she works and she's lecturing to us, to this panel of so-called experts, including yours truly, who's sitting there and listening to her. And look at the audience, it's mainly men, older men. And look at how she's beaming with confidence and proud of the achievement that she has, which is, I've become a great master farmer, and I can speak to all these visiting dignitaries out here. And the lady on the right-hand side who actually tweeted this to me, amongst others, who is a natural farmer, and when they were hit by a cyclone, she's showing how much better her crop has performed, that's on the left-hand side, compared to her neighbor's crop, which was not using natural farming. So she's showing off, and by the way, those letters saying ZBNF, it was called Zero Budget Natural Farming. It's not written by me, that's written by her on the photograph that she's tweeted out. That's the key impression that I got left behind with this. Really amazing. Anyway, we did the study, we presented the report, and to our amazement, we were invited by the FAO headquarters in Rome to present this. This is like, and I was nominated by the team to go and present. This is a bit like the rabbit walking into a lion's den and saying, oh, no, you guys should be vegetarian, it's good for your health. So, well, thankfully, I'm still alive. So that means that they did listen. They didn't actually destroy me. So this is moving forward. Not fast enough, not far enough, but moving forward. These are the countries where the TEEB agri-food approach has been tested out, and various funders, including the Commission and IKI from Germany, the Global Environment Facility, have certainly helped in there. But as you can see, it should be obvious to any of you that, oh, hang on, only 2 countries in Africa? That doesn't make sense. Yeah, exactly right. It doesn't make sense. So we need to do more, a lot more, not just in Africa, but also in Asia and also in Latin America. So there's more to go on this, and that's part of what needs to be done. And finally, conservation is good investment. And I don't need to convince you guys, but we have a commons problem with many dimensions. Open access is part of the problem. Lost productivity is a result. Perverse subsidies are still significant. We need to get this done. This is an unfinished task, and this was all there in the TEEB report. This is from the World Bank study, which is that yes, we are investing in fishing capacity and mainly trawler fleets, and as a result of that, the trawler fleets get more and more effective at taking out a resource which is scarce. Now, when I last heard, economics is the science of scarcity, and it's about trying to improve scarce resources. The scarce resource here, my friends, as you know, is the fish. It's not trawler fleets, and yet what we're investing in is trawler fleets. So net result, sure. Trawler fleet capacity increases, and the catch per unit capacity decreases, both at the same time. And you basically get nothing, a lot of waste and a lot of inequity in the process as well, which is clearly not what we want. yes, protected areas work, I'm convinced. And this is an example that was used in the TEEB reports. It was about Georges Bank, the protected area in the Gulf of Maine, not far from where I am right now. And a story was told to me by the gentleman who was then working with the US government, who was involved in getting these New England areas closed. And this is what happened to him. So this is the picture taken by him from his hotel room, where he was holed up for 3 or 4 days whilst fishermen protested outside, and they hung an effigy of Dr. Andrew Rosenberg. That's the man I'm talking about. He then later on left the government and joined Conservation International, where I met him. He was their chief scientist for a while. But yeah, there was clearly a reluctance on the part of fisherfolk to accept that protected areas were useful. This is an example from Fogarty et al., which I shared, among others, with the European Commission, who was constantly bombarded by fishermen of fishing communities in Europe, telling them how they were totally wrong to be supporting marine protected areas. And I showed them this example of how vessel hours and fishing catch was actually highest in the closed areas, at the edge of the closed areas. And at that point, I think the bureaucrat actually called in his team and said, "Have you seen this?" And he was frowning, and we can never quite interpret bureaucrats. When they frown, it could be a good thing or a bad thing. And this time, it turned out to be a good thing, because he was saying, "Have you seen this?" very pointedly to his juniors. And they said, "No, sir, yes, okay, fine." So I just felt when I left that meeting that somehow a penny had dropped, and maybe that made some difference in their thinking. More to come on that. But let me just come back to the final thing, which is, like, when we talk about environmental impacts and nature impacts, it is the private sector that is driving most of the negative impacts. And disclosing major, this is like, again, I'm giving you pictures of the actual recommendations summarized by me on 20th of October 2010. It's 14 years ago, right? So this is how long it takes stuff to happen. Disclosing all major externalities in annual reports and accounts. Reflecting environmental liabilities and changes in natural accounts. I mean, this is what I'm still doing. My own company's purpose is to make this happen. That is our social purpose, if you like. And we're working on it. But the good news is, it's at least the basic ideas are getting distilled and accepted. People have sort of grudgingly, and in some cases actively, like the Capitalist Coalition, and with the inspiration of Partha Dasgupta's Inclusive Wealth Report as well, leverage the fact that, if Dasgupta and the United Nations uses 4 capitals, well, maybe we, the business sector, should use 4 and not 6 or 7 or 5 that we keep talking about. So they're moving in that direction. The International Foundation for Valuing Impacts, led by Sir Ronnie Cohen, launched their project's first major deliverable, which is a few methodology statements, which are shared, common, they're standardized basically, and a few value factors, the actual calculation factors that companies can use for free to work out what their impacts are. And that was literally 2 days ago. I was delighted to meet him, only for the first time, but we've been exchanging a lot over emails and so on. But yeah, this is moving forward. So there is a kind of gradual consensus of, let's use a framework with 4 capitals to measure the impacts of companies. And hopefully, let's start beginning to disclose them. Now, of course, when you say let's move the framework, 4 capitals is the high-level framework. But when you break up 4 capitals and get to the detail, there's a devil in the detail. There's maybe many devils in the details. And here's what we did, as in my company GIST, together with our key competitor, that is Y4, a research team in Germany, and a corporate and investor advisor in Germany. We decided to collaborate. We said, there's no point us having different frameworks. Let's sit down and discuss how we can have one. And they said, yeah, exactly what we were thinking as well. And we've agreed. We've agreed not just a common high-level framework, which is obvious, the 4 capitals, but right down to the details, as in what environmental drivers are we going to measure and value and report on? What social drivers and what human, as in training, health and safety, and fair wages drivers, are we going to focus on? Of course, produce capital is well known. We've got the GDP metrics, and that's well known. Value addition at the GDP level is thankfully already decided about, so we don't have to think about it too much. But we've published this, and this is probably the first step towards what I call corporate biodiversity footprinting. And I'm going to demo you what that means. A company's operations generates, in some cases, if it's forestry, fisheries, and agriculture, and maybe mining and invasive tourism and so on, it might generate direct impacts on biodiversity, on ecosystems and species. But more likely, it will generate indirect impacts that pressure ecosystems. The greenhouse gas emissions of a power plant will affect Amazon dieback and Indonesian rainforest dieback. The water usage of that same power plant would potentially affect riverine and coastal biodiversity, because that's where the water goes back 2 or 3 degrees higher. Getting those indirect impacts measured, I think that's the bigger challenge. And thankfully, using something called the potentially disappeared fraction of species, there is in fact progress in that direction. There are a few other methods, but as you can see, the one approach, there's an approach which says, no, let's look at the state of the ecosystem using mean species abundance or BII, biodiversity intactness index, and then try and figure out, what we did, what we didn't do. And it all becomes very sectoral and very rough and ready and very approximate. And you're kind of not differentiating between one company and the other. So between the good guys and the bad guys, so to speak, or the mediocre guys, you're not really differentiating if you just use sector-based approaches and stock evaluations from time to time and say, oh, well, based on our input-output model, this is roughly how much the energy sector is accountable for. What you need to do is impact evaluation down to the company level, which means life cycle impact assessment, which means looking at LCIA. And that's thankfully a well peer-reviewed area where the metric is known as PDF, the potentially disappeared fraction of species. And yeah, it's possible. So I'm going to now give you a quick snapshot of the actual platform that we are using for this. It'll take a bit of time to get into that, but I'll pull it up and I'll get it organized while we speak. But I want to close by suggesting this, that we have clearly a huge unfinished agenda. And again, going back to the original TEEB and its presentation, estimating business sector externalities, these are the main demands being made after when we finished at that time. That yes, please do this. We still haven't finished. We're still working towards it. Identifying and closing the ecology and valuation knowledge gaps. I mentioned a few in terms of ecosystem functions not being well mapped enough for all major ecosystems and ecosystem dynamics not being frameworked properly and so on. So there's quite a lot of work to be done there. And then communicating the society at large. Oh my God, have we failed? On one thing that we have failed is to communicate this. I think to the expert community, it worked in the sense that a lot of the people who did TEEB are now working on what's called TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. They're involved in those projects. So I think the expert level communication did happen. But the communication to the person on the ground, to the man and woman on the street, that, I'm sorry, my friends, we did not do that particularly well. But that's, I guess, work for the future. So I'll pause here and I'll meanwhile pull up my demonstration, but open the floor to enable you to ask me questions.
Thank you very much, Pavan. If anyone has any questions, you could raise your hand or type them into the chat. I'm going to start things off, if I may, with a non-economist question. Actually, first of all, I'd like to thank you for a really intriguing talk. I'm always intrigued how you approach corporations who, the one of the few things I know about economics, they're beholden to their shareholders to make profits. So how do you get them to become, essentially your guidelines are suggesting they should become better corporate citizens by understanding what their broader impacts are beyond the bottom line. And how do you begin? I guess I'm totally lost in how you begin to convince them that that's a worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah, no, hey David, that's actually a great question, and if I try to answer it quickly, it's only because I want to give time to others to ask questions. I could go on for an hour on just that one question of yours. But here's the 4 things that I tend to do, right? One is that I'll point out that today's externalities are tomorrow's risks and day after tomorrow's costs, which means if you are why? Because externalities do get internalized by design, which is, if you like, the Natural Capital Protocol or the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts. If they are successful in getting one methodology, and if every investor receives not just the performance of companies and its projection based on analysts, but also the impacts of companies and projections based on analyst numbers, wow, that'll change the way investors behave and think. So whose shares get bought and whose shares get sold will suddenly change. And that's every CEO and every CFO worries about that. So that's my first plank. Guys, people are getting to understand your externalities. Don't wait for the problem that you are causing to become obvious to your investors so that they don't want you in their portfolio. That's number one. Number two is then I point out that, look, if you transition to a lower impact mode or a lower impact mode of operation, you will achieve potentially lower costs because you've engendered innovation. You've asked and challenged your staff to think of different ways of producing the same goods or services, or maybe different goods and services which will achieve the same purpose for your clients because they are less impactful on nature. And you can use that for marketing those same goods and services. So your costs might go down because you're replacing energy sources, your materials. Your opportunity will increase because you're tapping the environmentally friendly, environmentally aware Gen Z consumer or investor. So you will potentially make an economic benefit in the process. Lower costs, higher incomes, new avenues of opportunity. So there's an economic argument why you should do this. Then third, I point out to them that, look, you hire young people. Yes, of course we do. Yes, of course we do. Right. Well, can you tell me any young person that you've hired who was not interested in the future of her or his existence and that of nature? No. Okay. Well, don't you want to inspire people and get the right people hired amongst the young? Yes, I do. Okay, fine. So you know what? Get involved with this. Talk about this. Do it and talk about it. You'll be more likely to hire smart young people whose loyalty will stay with you. And finally, it's these messages that actually get through. And the fourth one, which is a little bit cheeky, I appeal to the chief executive's ego. I tell him, buddy, I love what you've achieved for the company. It's fantastic. My God, your last bonus, I saw that. Whoa, that is amazing. But what is the legacy you want to leave for you, for your future? What do you want to be remembered as? A man who made more money for the company by selling sugared water, or a man who changed the world? That hits home, actually. That hits home. What's the legacy? What do you want to be remembered for? I ask them point blank, like I'm asking you.
Okay. Thanks very much.
It's these four like tricks, if you want to call it, but four devices that I've used again and again.
Yep.
And again. Some of them work.
One of the questions we have online is, how do you persevere and maintain enthusiasm and belief that change is possible through all this time given?
Well, man, it's tough. I mean, I think what inspires me. So I've got a team of 130 people, mainly young. When we were smaller, I used to joke with them that, every time I enter this office, the average age goes up by 5 years. So there's that much of age gap between me and the rest of the team. So I'm just inspired by the fact that these kids by my standards, but they're young adults, obviously. But these young adults are with me, and they're still with me, and they're still persevering with this. They inspire me. The fact that this team is actually working to solve a problem which affects their future. I should help them. I should do what I can to make them successful. So that's one. I was joking with Rashid the other day how I used to use the hypothetical example of, when I have a granddaughter, am I going to tell her that I use a discount rate of 4%, which means in 50 years' time, when she's my age, the value that she gets from nature is discounted to a point of 0.14, which is basically 4% discount for 50 years. Am I going to tell her that she's worth 1/7 of what or something is worth to her 1/7, according to me, to what it's worth to me? That's embarrassing, right? How do I even explain this to my daughters that I'm using a discount factor of 4%? Now I actually have a granddaughter, and I held her in my hands. She's 2 months old, and boy, I said, hang on, where did I get that 4% from? It should be 0%. So it's like I have actually changed. I think I was being too generous to myself. I think I'm worth less, and I think my grandchild is worth more. So therefore, discount rates have to be even lower than I in those days said it should be. Not 1.3%, but probably closer to 0.3%. Yeah. So this is how I inspire myself and continue, because there's hope where there's life.
Thank you so much. And this discounting thing you just played around with, We met in, where were we? In Belgium, right?
Yeah,
The
Belgium.
economist
Yeah.
meeting. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
that's
were
right.
getting one more award and I was keynoting. And it
Yeah,
was
that's
at
right.
that meeting that
Yeah,
you gave your example to that
yeah,
crowd, right? Which was
yeah,
really
that's great.
powerful. Yeah, thank you so much for this talk and all your work. My question is actually about your new company, the outfit that you created. You've
Yeah.
done so many things. You've worked for big investment banks, for the UN, for WWF, and you started as a physics graduate. So,
Yeah,
and
that's
our
right.
group of students, we have lots of different backgrounds, and many
Yeah.
of us actually move like you. So, tell us a little bit, if any one of our people here want
Yeah.
to start an NGO
Yeah.
or a private
Yeah.
thing, what is the experience you want to share with us?
Yeah, I think the key message is that, sorry, I'm sharing with you the platform, which is actually showing with you the impacts of BHP Group, which we have. We have not just the data, but building this was an effort of something like 350 person years. So initially, the 10 of us who were part of my original NGO then converted to a company and got some investment. So you just have to, I think my first point is that think big, right? Think big. I mean, this is a mammoth problem, changing the way companies are valued by including their externalities. It's a mammoth problem. So think big, but please start small. And we started small. Like my initial team was literally like 8 people, with 10 people is very soon, but it was like a tiny group, and I could pay all of them with just my bonuses from Deutsche Bank. It was not difficult, right? So we started small, but we acted fast. We keep posting little successes, getting a client, doing this, doing that, saying yes to people said, can you do this for us? The answer was yes. So think big, start small, act fast. And then gradually we grew, and recognition of our work grew, and then investors, proper investors, not me, proper investors invested in us, and therefore we can do more. And I think this is that key lesson and that sort of ethos that I like to share with you. Think big, start small, act fast, and stay with it, right? And don't just give up 1/3 of the way or halfway. Just go on. Continue until you go bust. Just succeed or go bust. Be prepared to go
Yes.
bust. Be prepared to go bust. Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Think big, start small,
Small,
and work fast. Yeah.
act fast, and
And
work fast. And here's an example. So
don't
this is
give up.
BHP.
Don't
We have
give up.
impacts. And don't give up. Yeah, absolutely. Can you see my screen? This is an actual screen where we are showing you the impacts of BHP Group. This is the impacts. $24 billion mostly. Can you see this? $24 billion of health
It's
costs
small.
mainly. Yeah, it's very small, but out of that is mainly waste generation impacts. And we know what is their biodiversity footprint, which is basically in PDF terms, potentially disappeared fraction, 4.8 times 10 to the -4. People were not able to understand that. So we've converted that to something called land conversion equivalence. And again, act fast. This took no more than 3 months to start with the idea to actually implement this land conversion equivalence, which means if you were to take forested areas around the planet on average and reduce the average forested areas, how much would you need to reduce them to get the same PDF as 1 year's operations of BHP? Well, the answer is 2,800 square kilometers. And here's the surprise, my friends. You can see most of this is because of water usage, and some of it, the yellow bar is because of waste generation, and there's greenhouse gases. If you look at, let's say, a similar size, or a big power company doesn't drill any holes, doesn't mine, doesn't destroy land, doesn't do any land conversion. You'd expect it to have a lower impact. Let me pick a power company that I know is doing none of those bad things, but their potentially disappeared fraction is even bigger than one of the world's largest mining companies. This is the bit, Rashid, that I find amazing, that people don't understand the importance of indirect impact still. That's what I meant about communication. So I share this slide at every opportunity saying, guys, let's think more widely than just, oh, let's stop the miners, let's stop the deforestation companies and so on. It's a bit more than that. And what's causing this? Of course, lots of things, but it's the water usage. Being largely a thermal power company, the water that they use is a few degrees higher when they put it back into the water, whether it's a river or a coastline. And green, obviously, they are still too much in. They do have some renewals, to be fair, but they are too much still using fossil fuels. So therefore, clearly, the greenhouse gas has impacts on biodiversity, on forests around the world, and so on. So this is the kind of stuff that we can do today with technology, which needs to go out there. I'll stop sharing here, but I just wanted to sort of give you a sense of what's possible with technology and with applying science and using technology to scale that science.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing that, and thank you very much for a wonderful and informative seminar, Pavan.